Good afternoon, Rotarians and friends. It is one of those rare occasions when a name heavily laden with meaning suits the person perfectly. In the Indian vernacular, the meaning of Nipun ranges from expert, proficient, benevolent, to talented and perfect. It is my huge honor and proud privilege to introduce the renowned, respected, loved and widely sought after Nipun Mehta, the founder of ServiceSpace.org, a unique incubator of projects that support a gift culture. Like most boys of that age, his high school goal was to become a tennis pro or a Himalayan yogi. By the third year of his computer science and philosophy degree at the University of California, Berkeley, he started his career at Sun Microsystems. However, disillusioned by the greed of that genre, he quit his job in 2001 to become what he calls a full-time volunteer. In January 2005, Nipun and his wife Guri put everything aside to embark on an open-ended, unscripted walking pilgrimage in India. In his own words, living on $1 a day, eating whatever food was offered, and sleeping wherever a flat surface was found, the couple walked 1,000 kilometers. And I quote, "To use our hands to do random acts of kindness, our heads to profile inspiring people, and our hearts to cultivate truth." Over the last 15 years, his work has reached millions, attracted more than 500,000 volunteers, and mushroomed into numerous projects like Daily Good, Awakening Circles, Karma Kitchen, Paid Forward Rickshaw, to name only a few. Among his many prestigious accolades, President Obama appointed him on a council for social change. The Dalai Lama recognized him as an unsung hero of compassion. Recently, the Euphrates Institute honored him as the 2019 Visionary of the Year, where he shared his long-time mission statement of life: bring smiles in the world and stillness in my heart. His life and energy has been dedicated to the enlightened harnessing and the creative use of the magical power of kindness and the spirit of generosity. He has converted generosity into a global enterprise. And what is that capital that helps him expand the reach of this ever-widening enterprise? Nipun terms it his compassion capital. Along with the undepletable capital, his global enterprise is fueled by Can you hear me? Along with his undepletable capital, his global enterprise is fueled by an abundant source of human volunteer energy. Nipun's work philosophy and life are an amalgam of idealism, optimism, positivism, and his favorite, giftivism. By any normal, proven economic and financial metric, his enterprise would have been doomed to failure long, long ago. But here he is, growing, glowing, and inspiring. Compassion personified. But wait, friends, there is also a genetic connection to this Sadbhavana. His parents, for 18 years at home in Santa Clara, have been holding their weekly Wednesday awakening circle, meditation and dinner meet for about 70 people. And this is for 18 years, dear friends. Hard-nosed business analysts may ask, what is the bottom line of his enterprise? Ladies and gentlemen, in tune with the spirit of this season, its bottom line, his corporate contribution is joy to the world. It will be our pleasure to hear the guru of giftivism, Mr. Nipun Mehta.
I feel like that was almost better than the talk. I'm going to try. That was so sweet. Thank you. I can. There's not much room. It's okay. Usually I do like to walk around, but I will stand here. Thank you. We're a little late, but should I shorten it? No. Okay. There you go. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. That really was a wonderful introduction because it brought my parents in. And, there's a beautiful quote I was recently thinking of that says, you can count the number of apples, you can count the number of seeds in an apple, but you can't count the number of apples from a seed. And I think for all of us, if we honor the roots, we really honor the uncountable. So I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to co-creating some goodness. It's okay. This is fine. Thank you. You guys can all hear me. Yes. So I'm going to tell you a few stories and a few ideas that perhaps we can all engage with. So to give you some background, as you already received, I started my usual journey like everybody else with this drive for success and more success and more success. And at some point that felt a little hollow, and so I started to get into service. I said, how do I serve others? And we went to a homeless shelter in 1999, and we said, what can we do? How can we help? We ended up building them a website. But more than the website, it was the experience of generosity that actually transformed me. And it was so transformative that we went and told our friends, and we said, hey, this generosity thing, you should try it. And mostly we say, okay, I'll do it when I retire, I'll do it later. But it ended up, for me, I just felt like, wow, this is a gold mine, and there's really no age restriction. I should start now. And I did. But as you mentioned, the third stage of my journey from service becomes its own kind of intoxication. It can. And I think it might have been for me. And so at some point, my wife asked me a question. It says, how do we know that we're not trapped in another box? And so we decided to go on a walking pilgrimage. Started at the Gandhi ashram. We said, okay, we'll have $1 between us. That's mainly just toiletries, and we would walk. And we walked south. We ate whatever food was offered and slept wherever place was offered. I mean, to say it was profound, I could give you a whole hour-long talk on the lessons I learned. But one of the biggest things you learn is usually when we're afraid, and we live in a world that is afraid, usually when we're afraid we shrink, and we gather and we accumulate, because we think that will be our security. On a walking pilgrimage, you have to do the exact opposite. Because first of all, your pockets are really small. So, because you have a backpack. I mean, how many apples are you going to store in your backpack, right? On a walking pilgrimage, you have to do the opposite. When you're afraid, you have to create a heart of love and give more, because in giving more, you are related. And as you are related, someone's cup of gratitude will overflow and take care of you. And so it's a very different operating system that goes on inside our head. And it taught me a lot. Every day my ego would take a giant beating, and every day I would get up and I'd say, okay, try again. I think it was much easier for my wife, so she can probably talk more about it. But I think what that taught me was really about the power of generosity, power of giving. And to put it, I know a bunch of you are from the business sector, so this is a fellow who teaches at Wharton Business School, very famous now, but a good friend of Service Space, good friend of mine as well. He says that in any given ecology, even here, we have a bunch of young people. I know where the ecology there is, but in general, he was looking at the business world. He says in any given ecology, you have three kinds of people. You have givers, you have takers who just take. On the other hand, you have givers who just give, right? Who give first and then think about receiving. And then in between, you have matchers. And so, how do you start to shift? He started to look at all these ecologies where you have some people who are, pretty selfish and worried. Not selfish in a bad way, but they just think. They have a design misunderstanding, like we did, right? If you're afraid, go gather and accumulate. These guys think that, if I have more, I'm in more control. Givers start to think in a different way. They say that if I give, I'm more related, and those relationships give me more resiliency. And so he started to look at what are the advantages of givers and takers. And it was very interesting that actually he expected that the givers would be at the bottom of the pyramid, but they weren't. Some of them were, but some of them were also at the top. And when givers succeed versus takers succeed, they succeed in very different ways. So he found out that actually givers are much more motivated. Givers are much better at connecting with people. Givers are much better at collaborating. You can go down the list. Leaders are actually much more effective leaders because they have far greater influence in a network. So he went down this list, and I think it was pretty powerful, but I think that where I contrast that with the world today is that we are moved by transaction. Most of our systems are transactional. And what that means is that we are not relational. Transactions turn everything into tit for tat. I do this for you, what are you doing back for me? A mother's love is not transactional. Right? What you see in this photo, you have a whole bunch of kids, everyone doing something for people after them, people in front of them. It's not a transaction. Because they're paying forward, what goes around eventually comes around, and they are in circle together. So how do we start to move from this addiction to transaction, which is good for certain things, but not good for everything? So how do we start to move from transaction to relationship? Because giving is much more relational. And this, I think, is not a trivial problem to solve. If you look at how we organize, how we manage things. So we used to organize with just straight out of fear, right? Like wolves, like gangs. Then we got a little bit smarter and we said, let's organize this fear, and we started to do command and control, which is how armies are organized. Then we said, well, let's organize like machines, where you have interchangeable parts. You do your job. If you don't do your job, I'll put somebody else in. But it turns out that when you take somebody out of an ecosystem, you're taking out all their relationships. We don't think about relationships. Right? We look at, I was talking with some major leaders in business, and we were talking about this, and we said, Google Maps is great, right? Because it gets you from point A to point B. Previously, you would have to ask like 10 people on the way, especially on a walking pilgrimage. It would be like, go there, and then go there, and then you'll see a cow, and in front of the cow, you'll see this banwala, and then ask him, and then he tells you where to go. But at a global level, or rather at a meta level, right, a countrywide level, how many connections have we stripped out because we have created Google Maps? So I'm not anti-Google Maps. I think Google Maps is fine, but they took out billions of connections every single day. And some of those serendipitous connections led to so much more. Right? So who is putting that back in? But we don't have that view because we have a very mechanistic, machine-like view of the world. But now we're sort of upgrading. Most corporations are machine-like. But we're sort of getting a little bit better. We're starting to say, hey, let's put values, let's be more like families, let's have a shared purpose, which is great. But I think where the real interesting thing is how do you start to look at life and organizing and groups of people as a living system? And if you start to do that, you really unlock deep generosity. And if you unlock generosity, you unlock a whole bunch of upstream benefit, as we saw from Adam Grant's research. So this question, an example that comes to mind, and then I want to leave you with a few sort of design principles from service phase. But an example that comes to mind is this farmer, this guy. He's a Japanese farmer, and on his farm something remarkable happens. He has apples, but his apples, when you cut them in half, they're called miracle apples. When you cut a slice, it never goes brown. And you say, oh, exactly. How is that? Well, why does an apple go brown? It goes brown because the iron compounds in the apple combine with the oxygen in the air, and it creates this oxidization. And so his apples don't do that. And you ask him why, he says, because I don't grow apples. My forest does. And you say, wait, what do you mean? And he says, well, most people on an apple farm, you have rows and rows of apples. He says, on my farm, I actually don't even remove the weeds. I don't plow on the soil. I don't have fertilizers or pesticides, which means everything coexists, which means that this one apple underneath the apple is a tree, but underneath the tree are roots, and those roots are interconnected to the roots of the entire forest. And as a result, that one apple has all these antioxidants. And so it doesn't go brown. But what is that philosophy when you start to look at the whole field? You don't just look for the apples, you're looking at the whole field.
What does that look like, right? So in service space, we have been reflecting on this at the level of social farming, if you want to call it that, right? What does it look like when you have a group of people starting to engage in this deep way, not in a transactional way, but in a relational way? I think it changes a lot of things. So I want to share with you 4 sort of core design principles to reflect on, which I think are applicable everywhere. And even if you don't take all 4, even just one of them is applicable. But in my case, or in our case with service space, they are progressive in nature. So, usually we start with impact, and then we have projects, right? You say, what do you want to do? You say, okay, here's my impact statement. This is what I want, how I want to change the world. You write your project plan, you hire a few people, and you say, maybe they have some inner transformation or not. This is not IT, not information technology, different kind of IT. So that inner transformation, for us, we flipped this. We said, we're going to start with that inner transformation. When you experience something inside, right? And that attracts people. And those people invariably create projects. And those projects have impact. So this is why in the early years of service space, they said it's doomed to fail. It's doomed to fail. Or more than that, it wasn't so much fail. They would say, oh, that's cute. That's what kids on this side would do. That's like a nice, sweet, kind lemonade stand. But actually, it has ended up creating a whole different field of intelligence. So the 4 things. Right? First one is this design principle that everyone is good at something. We tend to look, you have me up on stage, you have anyone you have up on stage, we tend to think the people on stage are great at something, and everyone else kind of has to fit into that category, not just stage, but that's how we do hiring, right? But what happens if we turn that around? One of my favorite stories is actually the story by Mother Teresa, which I think really hits the nail on the head. Okay, kids are gonna like this, I think. It's hard to have like a whole wide range, because then you don't know whether to appeal to the kids or the adults or the business folks or the NGO folks. We got them all in this room, so I'll try to throw a little bit of everything. So Mother Teresa at one point was she had a guest coming to visit her, and this guest was a big funder. And so they come in, they finish their tour, and at the end of the tour, this funder says, hey, I'd like to take a photo with Mother Teresa. Okay, so they take a photo. They come in, click. Okay, they look at the photo, not so good. Mother Teresa, can you move a little to the right? So Mother Teresa moves right. Click, not so good. Says, Mother Teresa, can you move back a little bit? And my friend who happened to be there watched this and said, this is ridiculous. You're using Mother Teresa as your prop for your wall. This is a global icon of compassion. You can't do that. And then they click, still not right. They go in and move Mother Teresa's face around. And Mother Teresa just lets them, and my friend is furious. And at the end, when the funders leave, she goes to Mother Teresa and she says, Mother, why didn't you say anything? And Mother Teresa gave her one sentence that actually changed her life. And that sentence was this. It says, my dear, there are multiple forms of poverty. That yes, the child who comes has material poverty, that needs to be addressed. You can't undermine material poverty, but that's not the only form of poverty. This person wants attention. They want my photo. They want to move my face around so they have the perfect photo op so their living room wall looks amazing. That's a kind of poverty. It says, it's okay. I'm here to serve all kinds of poverty. But what she says underneath it is also that there are multiple forms of wealth, just as there are multiple forms of poverty. And what are those kinds of wealth? Right? I'm looking here, right here at Venkat. I actually wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Venkat and his big-heartedness. He's always doing so many incredible things. He just told me he's going to be at the Ramanashram with a quadriplegic woman, just taking her around to various places. Like, he just ends up saying yes to so many people. But I think what it really starts to point to is this idea that there are multiple forms of wealth and what are these other forms, right? Venkat, you can come up here and give us a lecture on it, maybe the next one, yeah? But it takes a very different kind of a person. It takes a very different kind of a heart. For all of us, wealth equals money, by and large. But money is a form of wealth, sure. But there are so many other forms, right? As you can see, nature is a form of capital, community. You can go down the list. Technology, certainly culture. How do you start to engage with our time is a tremendous kind of capital. So how do you start to reflect on this? This is my friend Firoz and his son, so Firoz at the age of 36 had 5,000 people under him. He was he was an MD at SAP. And he was, having a storybook life, and then he had a son who was autistic. Completely changed his life around. But he did something remarkable. He took that as a life lesson, and he realized instead of saying, usually when you hire, you say, okay, do you fit with my program? Otherwise, next. You fit with my program? Next, right? Like you're looking for a certain type of a person, and if the other person doesn't fit, you swipe them out. He turned it around and he says, okay, I want to hire these 5 people who are on the autism spectrum, and I'm going to restructure my problem so that I can include their gifts. If everyone is good at something, what are they good at? So he realized that people in a particular span of autism, they're never late, they never get tired, they never lie. And he was like, oh my God, I wish I had normal staff like that, right? And so he hired these people, and lo and behold, it actually became so successful that Harvard did a case study on it. SAP, then comes CEO of SAP, came in and he says, I want 1% of all my staff by 2020 to be on the autism spectrum. And now Microsoft and Google have taken these pledges. But it all starts with him saying, everyone is good at something. How do you start to hold that worldview? How do you lead with that? And you can do all kinds of creative things. This is a monk who has a CD, but he says, I'm not going to sell my CD for financial capital. I would much rather prefer kindness capital. And so he says, do an act of kindness and share your story, and I'll send you the MP3s. Honoring a different form of capital. We did a conference recently, and we said, just as you had normal tickets, and we did have Visa, MasterCard, Discover, you can pay by those, but you can also pay by volunteering at a nonprofit and sharing a reflection around that, or you can do 5 acts of kindness, or you can create a 5-minute selfie about the theme of the conference. Okay? Or you can sit in silence for 8 hours. And it's amazing. Like people did, like this is an engineering student at UC Berkeley. He said, I really want to come to this conference. Neither one of those are engineering students. That's a different story. This one is an engineering student. And she's sitting there and she said, I spent 8 hours on that tree. And for the first time in my life, I listened to what was going on inside and wrote this incredible reflection. Now imagine you have 800 people, and out of that, 300 people have offered in alternate forms of wealth. Can you imagine the kind of engagement they bring to it versus the entitlement that you would have if it was transactional? It was so powerful. And the ripples that emerge from that are so powerful. But it starts with this idea that everyone is good at something. You just have to learn how to honor that good. You cannot look at everything with a narrow funnel. You can, but then you're just not going to get much engagement. You'll be isolated, disconnected, and lonely, which is what we have in our culture today. So yeah, lots of acts of kindness. We got Obama to say this, right? Obama says we should remember that capital is not just financial, it's social, informational, experiential in so many ways. And I would add to that there's a million kinds of capital. Really, it's limited by our creativity. So that's the first step, right? The second step, there's 2 or 4, and then we can do some Q&A. I hope this is my water. Okay. It could be yours, but... No, I don't need any more, thank you. Everyone is not just good at something, everyone can be great at giving. And what does that mean? That means that we actually, what Martin Luther King Jr. said, that everyone is great because everyone can serve, in the sense that we actually want to liberate our gifts and give. And this is just neuroscience. If you have questions, I can go down the list of neuroscience after neuroscience after neuroscience. You would be amazed. They did this research at Harvard, actually, Michael Norton. And they went to people and they said, okay, I'm going to give you this money. You can do 2 things with it. Go shopping or give it to somebody else. And a lot of people said, okay, yeah, I like giving. They did it. they actually felt good. But even the skeptics who say, oh, of course, I want to go shopping and get a few things for myself. Guess what your brain rewards? Giving to other people. Even when you don't think consciously that you want to, there's so many layers of our subconscious, and we're just wired. As soon as you give, you move from the me to the we, and that is rewarded by our brains. You have serotonin that's released, oxytocin that's released, you have dopamine that's released, you have all these endorphins that start kicking in. So we are wired to be generous, to care, to be related, but we often don't design for that. So this is one of my friends who unfortunately had passed away a couple of years ago. This is Raghu. Now, Raghu lost his legs when he was young. And as a result, most people look at someone like that and say, okay, you can be great. You know, on our walking pilgrimage, people would say, it's great that you want to give, but before you give, you have to have something. Right? That's a very common question. Like, how can you give if you don't have anything? And I said, oh, does that mean I was born bankrupt? That you're empty, you come in, then you pile on a few things, and then you give from what you piled on? I'm not so sure that's what I subscribe to. I don't think we're born bankrupt. We add certain kinds of wealth, and that has its value, but we actually have a lot to give. So like this guy, most of us think he needs our sympathy, that he needs to, you know, he doesn't have it, and he actually lives in the slums, so you can easily box him into a certain category. But Raghu said, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. I want to serve, so what can I do? And so he decided, so when he walks with his hands, right? So he would go, and so as he's going like this, imagine him walking between the aisles here, right? And you're living in these slums. What is one kind of capital that he has that probably none of us can have as immediately as he does? Trust. No one is afraid of him. And because they aren't afraid of him, they come and start sharing stories. Lots of women in this community have been abused, were abused, by a lot of the men in the community who were then abused by so many people outside. So there's this pay it forward chain. Raghu says, I want to help these women. So he did something remarkable. He decided, you see these plants? He started growing these plants. These are tulsi plants. So all these women that would come and share their stories, he would say, I'm going to give you a tulsi plant, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to pray with you. And they share their stories. And in sharing, they feel a little lighter. In praying, they feel held. By having a visit from Raghu, they feel connected. And then the next time he's walking, he'll come up and say, how's the tulsi plant doing? But underneath it, he's saying, how are you doing? In a span of 2 years, he gave away more than 1,500 tulsi plants. But what's even more amazing about it is that which corporation could have created that impact? Which NGO could have created that impact? Which CSR budget could have created that impact? None. Because you can't go in as an NGO and say, look, yeah, talk to me and now I'm going to solve your problems. Only a Raghu can do that, but we don't have spaces for the Raghus of the world to actually liberate their gifts. So how do we start to think in that way, that not just that everyone is good at something, everyone actually wants to liberate those gifts. They want to give because it feels great to give, and we are related with that. So the third thing, this is where things get really interesting, right? If everyone starts to share their gifts with multiple forms of capital, and if those gifts start to get connected, you create an entirely new possibility. This is where my most recent metaphor has been, if you combine hydrogen, if you are hydrogen and I'm oxygen, and neither one of us is liquid, but we come together in a particular way, all of a sudden, H2O is water. We create a whole new property. So if this kind of giving gets connected, it creates a whole new property. It creates an entirely different kind of field of innovation. So I'll tell you, this is one of the motivations, right? Like you look at someone like Reid Hoffman. I'm guessing most of us are on LinkedIn. I was at ISB yesterday, day before. And I was like, okay, how many of you are on LinkedIn? And like every single hand goes up. And in this sea of hands, I said, well, here's what Reid Hoffman says, who's the founder of LinkedIn. And he said, look, social networks do best when they tap into one of the 7 deadly sins. Right? Facebook is ego, Zynga, which is a video gaming company, is sloth, and he says, my own company is greed. So the reason why my company is so amazing is because I'm tapping into your greed, and that's okay. You can say, okay, that's one thing, but the question is, who is creating solutions for tapping into the 7 viral virtues, so to speak? So we decided that as we unlock everyone's gifts, we decided to try a few experiments that are designing for 7 viral virtues. And so, for example, I don't know how many of you have heard of Karma Kitchen. How many of you have heard of Karma Kitchen or Seva Cafe? Okay, so I need to explain it. That's not bad though, 20, 30% maybe? For those that don't know, Karma Kitchen is an experiment. So we take over a restaurant and you walk in as a guest and you would have your meal like you would any other restaurant. But here, at the end of your meal, your check would read 0. It's 0 because someone before you has paid for you and you are trusted to pay forward whatever you want for people after you. Now, how much would you pay? How little do you pay? Right? Do you pay more? Is the value of something just the food that you receive, or is it the context also? Is it how you're feeling inside? And what happens when you walk into a restaurant? Now imagine, you're in a restaurant like this, right? And everyone, you walk in on a normal day and it's a transactional restaurant. Now you walk in on a day like this, and the vibe is so different. We used to be the top-rated restaurant in Berkeley in the early days. Now it's in 23 countries around the world. In India too, we've been running it every day for the last 11 years in Ahmedabad. So you go walk into this place, and you realize no one is paying for themselves. And that's great at an individual level because people are very moved and they're very perplexed and all kinds of things happen. But what is really amazing is the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect is that somehow something happening on this table is affecting that table, and that table is affecting this table, and everyone comes in and it's like, why is everyone so happy? And we're like, we're not happy, we're trying to just get you the plates, you know? But somehow everyone feels there's, and that something starts to make people behave differently, repeatedly. It starts to put people not in the me space, but in the we space. So one of my favorite examples is, there are so many stories, and some of them will take too long. So I'll give you a nice, cute, short story of how someone comes in. So one of my friends, he was doing a PhD at UC Berkeley. He comes in and he says, I don't know, I like you, you're a nice guy, but this, man, I don't know, how does this work, you know? Like, is that, he had a lot of questions and a lot of doubts. And so I said, okay, that's fine. You know, best way to understand, you come. You do dishes, you serve people, you're in the back, you know, do a volunteer for, you know, 6, 7, 8 hours, and then you'll see. So he comes in, and he sits down on this table, and he sees somebody walking in on this table, and he's serving them, and they have a nice interaction, and at the end of the meal, they get a check, like everybody. The check reads 0, and the guy, you know, like, you would imagine, if this happened to you, you would be a little confused too, right? Like, what do you do? So this guy was confused. He looks at his waiter, and he says, so, are you telling me you just trust me to pay whatever I want? And he says, don't ask me, but I'm confused myself, but you know, I think that's how it's supposed to work. She says, okay. He sits, he reflects, he's thinking, you know, how much to give, how much to give. And he takes out his wallet, takes out $100 bill, which is a big amount. You'd usually pay 20 or something like that. So he takes out a $100 bill, tells this guy, says, you know, I really think what you guys are doing here is interesting. Here's 100, and I trust you to bring me back whatever change you want to give me. So now this guy who was already unclear, who already had a lot of question marks, he is completely confused, right? Like, what are you gonna do? Now imagine if you're in that guy's position, okay. So he comes to me, he looks at me, goes in the back, and he says, what am I supposed to do? Like, what's the rule book say, right? I said, I don't know. I mean, we've never had this kind of situation. And I said, it's not my problem, it's your problem. You figure it out. So he's like scratching his head, he's thinking, you know, and this is, mind you, this was a guy coming in a bit skeptical, right? So he's thinking, what am I gonna do? How should I do this? And then he does something remarkable. And this is the power of this space. He takes out his wallet. He takes out a 20 from the wallet. And he goes back to this guy and gives him 100. And exactly like that, the guest on the thing, he's like, what, where am I in heaven? Like, what's going on? You know, like, who are you guys? Like, where do you come from? But what compelled him to do that? And if this was just a one-off thing, then you can say, okay, that was just an exceptional case. But you see this repeatedly with all kinds of people, in all kinds of ways, with all kinds of capital, that giving begets more giving. That if I'm in a space of generosity, I don't want to be transactional. I'm thriving and looking for a way to engage to give in a myriad different ways. And this, of course, is not just limited to a restaurant, right? This is a friend of mine. He runs a magazine, and the magazine, he says, I'm going to take out all dollar signs from now on, and it's going to be all offerings of gratitude. And you would say, how does this work? You know, but it's remarkable. This is a woman that runs an acupuncture clinic in this way. From now on, you only pay forward. How much would you pay forward? But more than that, she starts to have deep relationships with everyone coming in because it's not just transactional, right? This is a rickshaw driver. You mentioned this in the introduction. Right? This is a rickshaw driver. He's just sitting in his rickshaw. Not only does he say that, look, there's no meter. I don't know. I think Chennai is notorious for this too, right? Like, especially if you get a guy like me. I sit in a rickshaw and they're gonna be like, tourist tax, buddy, you know. And they'll be like, yeah, Coimbatore is just on the way. I don't know, something like that. And so you sit in the rickshaw and you said, man, this country's got no morals, you know, it's just going down the drain. And everyone's thinking, yeah, how do we change the rickshaw drivers? But you live with them and they say, look, we've just been shortchanged, and I have my kids too, and they have their dreams too. What am I going to do, right? So you look at that and you say both sides are stuck in a logjam. Well, this guy, Uday Bhai, says, I'm going to change that. He says, I'm going to change that, not by coercion, not by saying, let's have an NGO and let's train all the rickshaw drivers to be honest, because they would like to train the rest of us to be more caring, right? But it doesn't work on us and it doesn't work on them. So they're then saying, he says, I'm going to use not by power and coercion, I'm going to do it by the power of my own intrinsic love. So he says, you sit in my rickshaw, no meter. No meter, because I trust that if I give to you, you will respond to that love with greater love. And everyone asks him, not only that, yeah, that's worthy of an applause, yeah. Not only that, you sit in his rickshaw and you start connecting with him, and all of a sudden, you never know, he might bring a dabba of like teplas, you know, and he'll say, oh, my wife made these teplas, these are for you, and you're like, which planet are you from? And then at the end, everyone asks him, right? He's been doing this for 7 years in Ahmedabad. Everyone asks him, how does this work? Especially people like us, right? And really our question is, are you making the money? Right? Are you making the money? Because we're so obsessed with that. And he says, yeah, I am making money. He says, I make the same amount that I used to make before. Here's my ledger book. Some people paid more, some people paid less, but more or less it is working out for me financially. But he says, that's the wrong ledger. The real ledger is this other book. This is where I ask people how they felt sitting in my rickshaw. And you sit in his rickshaw and you realize you're being taught without being schooled. You are being given a lesson in generosity from a guy who needs all his daily wages, and he's betting on your heart. It is not Bill Gates doing philanthropy and trying to change you. It is a rickshaw driver being the change and holding you with no expectations. And in that holding, people are just incredibly moved. They take vows for life and they write in that other book, and he says, this is the wealth that I care about. Such people exist, they are there. And such kind of a world can be possible. Such kind of a world is a gift ecology. That if I start seeing that everyone can give in their own ways, and if that giving starts to get connected, you have an entirely different possibility that you previously couldn't even touch. So on to the last thing here, is if we start with this idea that everyone is good at something, and you say that, look, if everyone has a gift, everyone can be great at giving, and when that giving gets connected, you create a gift ecology. Then you get to the final thing, which is that everyone is connected to everything. And if you just say this without that foundational work, it just sounds like, yeah, it's platitude. Everyone's connected to everything. Can't you see? Yeah, every oxygen, all the breath, or all the air I'm breathing is the air you're breathing, and we're circulating and we're sharing with each other. Now, yeah, we can give lip service to that, but if you've actually created that foundation, all of a sudden that rings true in a very deep way. Right? And I love this metaphor of, not a metaphor, this actual mathematics of how this is just illustrates what is possible and how blind we actually are. In a room full of you just take this one side, in a room full of just 50 people, if we are just broadcasting, we get at 50 connections. This is the TV model. But if we start to connect one-to-one, you would have 1,225 connections. But if you start to have what you call, what is now possible on the internet, if you start to create a many-to-many network, you have 100 million trillion connections with just 50 people. Now, how many of us are alive to that possibility? Most of us look at very solid room full of very slow-moving entities, right? That's sort of how we see it. And we see it with our self-centeredness. Are you useful to me? Are you not useful to me? Next. Okay, yeah, you're a CEO of Infosys. Okay, yeah, I want to talk to you, and I want to see what I can get ahead and what I can get from you. And when we do that, we actually lose. We actually blind ourselves. We cannot see 100 million trillion. And internet allows this possibility, but it allows it for profit. We have seen protests for this, but we have not seen it for love. We have not seen it for compassion. So if those bonds are of compassion, all of a sudden, a whole new field, like I said, is possible. So different ways to organize, but I think I'll skip this, but we talk about this idea that it just, when you can actually see 100 million trillion in a room full of 50 people, you can't lead in the same way. Leadership turns into laddership. Laddership is this idea that you're helping other people go on top of you, right? You're helping actually hold the entire field. Like that farmer who creates miracle apples is not saying, I have an apple farm. He's actually saying, I have a forest. So how do you start to hold the whole forest? Who do you have to be to hold a forest, not just apples? And so I won't talk too much about this, but it's worth seeing, it's worth reflecting on how there are very significant shifts. And especially when you go to business schools, right? They teach you how to plan and execute, have a strong center, focus on, breadth and scale, try to talk about efficiency. But what laddership does is it starts to really have a very different set of metrics. And this is something that we often don't think about. But if you have questions, I can talk more about it. But I want to leave you with an image. And it's this image. This is thousands of birds that all of a sudden, it's a starling, so it's a murmuration of starlings is what they call it. We can call it a flock of birds for now. All these birds saw that there was this giant bird coming to attack them. They said, oh my God, we're in trouble. What should we do? And there was a photographer in Spain. He was just clicking photos, and he didn't even realize that he actually took this photo. It was that quick. So all these birds realized, wait a second, we need to come and get together and do something because there's somebody, going to attack us. And so they spontaneously created this giant bird. In 10 seconds, they created this bird. They lasted for 10 seconds, and boom, another 10 seconds later, you didn't even notice it. So what kind of intelligence is this? Now imagine if we are in this room and I say, okay, everyone, you can't talk, you can't sign. Let's create, let's forget even this intricate shape. Let's create a circle, right? Or let's create a square. You know how complicated that would be, right? So what is the intelligence here that's unlocking this possibility? And it's everywhere in nature. It's actually inside our bodies too. So if it's inside of us, if it's outside of us, where are we going wrong and how do we start to, and it's not a bad critique in that sense. I think it's just a design upgrade. We just need to change that. We just need to, it took us thousands of years to put wheels on bags. It was a very simple idea. I came from the airport just now, it's like, yeah, wheels on bags is a great idea, but how do you start to, it took us a long time, so I think similarly, how do you start to design for this kind of a flow? And for that, I think, if we go back to Adam Grant, and that question, how do you start to create a giver culture? And it turns out to be surprisingly simple. It takes just one consistent contributor. One person who looks for the collective good first and the personal good second. So if I am a consistent contributor, I show up, what will happen in this room, right? What will happen is everyone will start to, all the matchers will say, hey, this is a giver circle, I'm gonna bring my giving self. And as soon as you start to do that, trust skyrockets, collaboration skyrockets, and productivity. This is I think Kellogg School, Kellogg School of Management. This research of how just productivity just skyrockets, right? So it's even if you're after those outcomes, it ends up being very, very clear that generosity can be a very powerful amplifier. And so I think Gandhi, of course, told us very clearly that we must be the change we wish to see in the world. But I would add to that, and I would say that when what we do is in service to who we are becoming, then all of a sudden we can shape the world in ways that we may not have even thought of. So go out, give, practice love, and be ready to be surprised. The flock of birds are here. Thank you very much.